My name is Rudra Chaudhary. I'm the director of Carnegie India. It's a great privilege and honor to host what I can only hope, and we at Carnegie hope will be a day of productive discussions across 4 panels, ranging from the future of the Indo-Pacific, maritime cooperation, economic integration, and different types of partnerships that might be discussed, not only within the panels, but hopefully from a lot of contributions from you in the audience. It gives me great pleasure to introduce and welcome the first panel, an eminent panel. Could I please ask on stage His Excellency Kenji Hiramatsu, Ambassador of Japan to India, His Excellency Chutintorn Gongsakdi, Ambassador of Thailand to India, Ambassador Preeti Saran, former Secretary East, the Ministry of External Affairs, and Professor Srinath Raghavan, Senior Fellow at Carnegie India and Professor at Ashoka University. Please.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this inaugural session on India, Japan, ASEAN, and the future of the Indo-Pacific. We have a very distinguished panel here to sort of get us started, and the plan is to request each of our distinguished speakers to speak for about 10 minutes by way of opening remarks. I will then engage with them on a little bit of a back and forth before we open up to the rest of you. We have an hour and 15 minutes or so. May I please request Ambassador Hiramatsu to get us started? Yes, sir. Wherever it's convenient to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It is my great pleasure to engage in discussion with Ambassador Gongsakdi of Thailand, Ambassador Preeti Saran, to kick off this seminar. The title of the seminar itself is very appealing for me. The Indo-Pacific has become a buzzword now, and the prospect of sharing diverse perspectives in terms of the Indo-Pacific, India-Japan-ASEAN certainly sounds very promising too. As a diplomat, I often direct my thought towards a long-term viewpoint. What kind of a future do we need to deal with? What is required to ensure stability, peace, and prosperity? In doing so, I always visualize world map because we also need to have a broad geographical outlook. Today, our focus is on India, Japan, ASEAN. So I will not spend much time on the Japan-India relationship. But the uniqueness of our relationship is found in how Prime Minister Abe, Prime Minister Modi engage in strategic discussion with a world map in front of them. No wonder why our relationship is called Special Strategic and Global Partnership. So let me begin by a long-term perspective. By 2028, India is projected to be the 3rd largest economy, only after the United States and China. India will also be the most populous country in the world. Looking east, ASEAN will continue its robust growth. In PPP terms, Indonesia will soon be the 4th largest economy. All ASEAN countries, including Thailand, will increase their economic weight, as the region is expected to continue its growth by around 5% annually. And Japan will remain an important, responsible, and reliable partner in the world, with considerable economic and technological vigor, stable governance, and sophisticated social system. When we look at the world's map with such a perspective, we'll instantly notice that major players to shape the future world, the United States, Japan, China, ASEAN, India, can only be well captured by the concept of the Indo-Pacific. What is more, the Indo-Pacific reaches the shore of Africa, which is also endowed with rich natural resources and human capital. the Indo-Pacific is a relatively new perspective. A preliminary idea was first presented by Prime Minister Abe in his speech titled Confluences of Two Seas here in India in 2007. Since then, the international community has gradually embraced this viewpoint, and now the Indo-Pacific is buzzing in the international dialogue. I think this perspective has caught our attention because it highlights the sheer potential of the Indo-Pacific. Then we have to seek how we can best realize this in the years to come. First, I like to underscore the significance of fundamental principles to sustain peace and prosperity. I cannot emphasize more how much this region has benefited from the free movement of goods, services, and people, anchored by the principle of the freedom of navigation and overflight. And these are all indispensable parts of the rule of law. The rule of law is paramount in its importance as it shapes states' behaviors, thereby increasing transparency and predictability. Second, the pursuit of economic prosperity is an important pillar of a free and open Indo-Pacific. Enhanced connectivity is critical from this perspective. Let me come back on this point later. Third, we need to reaffirm our commitment to peace and stability, strengthening the capacity of maritime law enforcement and maritime domain awareness, as well as cooperation in such fields as humanitarian assistance and disaster relief can forge and demonstrate such commitment. In essence, these three elements from the gist of a free and open Indo-Pacific, which Japan is espousing. I am pleased that India has also expressed its clear vision for free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific, as is expounded by Prime Minister Modi last year at the Shangri-La Dialogue. Now, ASEAN is also engaged in serious discussions in crystallizing their vision for the Indo-Pacific. A high-level policy dialogue on Indo-Pacific cooperation will be held a week later in Jakarta. Based on its long-term friendship with ASEAN, Japan is eager to engage in further dialogues with ASEAN over how to give shape to the Indo-Pacific we want. It is a matter of fact that the other countries such as United States and Australia also have their own visions for this region. The important thing is to share our visions and think and act together for the better future of the Indo-Pacific. I believe such a future can be pursued in a flexible and multi-layered fashion through various channels such as bilateral, trilateral, or broader forms of cooperation. I think BIMSTEC also can play a very important role in shaping Indo-Pacific concept. With such a grand vision, we need as many like-minded partners as possible. Every state which abide by international rules and norms can join and play an invaluable role in establishing a stable and prosperous region or regional order. Inclusiveness is a key, as rightly pointed out by Honorable Prime Minister Modi. I earlier talked about the importance of strategic connectivity. We should promote concrete projects to increase connectivity in this region. As I am ambassador of Japan to India, let me take up some example of how Japan and India are coordinating on such concrete projects. In Bangladesh, India is constructing roads and Japan is constructing bridges in the same segment. Japan is also building the Jamna Railway Bridge, on which locomotives provided by India will run. In Sri Lanka, Japan, India, and Sri Lanka are promoting LNG-related infrastructure. In Lakshmi State, in Myanmar, Japan and India are joining our hands to provide housing, education, and electrification. We are also coordinating our assistance in Africa, such as in Kenya. Though I will not go into details, Suffice it to say that Japan is engaged in various projects with ASEAN countries and other partners as well. In doing so, we are mindful of providing quality infrastructure. Quality infrastructure ensures international standards such as open access, transparency, economic efficiency in terms of lifetime cost, and fiscal soundness of the recipient countries. Responsibility and accountability of all stakeholders, including donors and lenders, carries significance in ensuring quality infrastructure. Of course, Japan is also actively supporting capacity building and technology transfer too. Before closing, I'd like you to think of the world map once again. You now visualize that both India and ASEAN are situated at the heart of the Indo-Pacific. Imagine, further, an Indo-Pacific which is better connected, free and open and inclusive. I am sure you'll feel how natural and even indispensable it is for Japan, India, ASEAN to work together for such an end. Today's seminar is very well timed, and it provides an excellent opportunity to share our visions and views about this region. The seminar will touch upon some of the elements I raise in subsequent sessions. I hope active discussion will ensure, bearing in mind the long-term and broad geographical perspectives. I'd like to thank Carnegie India and also Palavan Learning Systems for providing us this opportunity. I hope today's seminar will be a great addition to our ongoing and future collaboration. I wish you a most productive seminar today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for those remarks. Ambassador Preeti Saran, may I request you to.
Good morning, fellow panelists, distinguished guests, dear friends, excellencies. It's really a pleasure for me to be invited to participate in this opening session of this important seminar entitled India-Japan-ASEAN, Promoting Stability in the Indo-Pacific. I think this is a very important topic and couldn't have been more timely, especially as Ambassador of Japan pointed out, there has already been a certain impetus that has been given to this subject, given the scope of our individual relations, whether it's bilateral India-Japan, whether it's India-ASEAN, or it's Japan-ASEAN. So in that context, and we talk of Indo-Pacific, of course, I can recall that this particular, of course, Ambassador of Japan pointed out how Prime Minister Abe had articulated it more than a decade back. But as far as this particular concept of the definition of Indo-Pacific is concerned, I would like to recall our own Prime Minister's vision that he had articulated on 1st of June at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. And speaking at that particular forum, he had stated, and I quote, "For thousands of years, Indians have turned to the east, not just to see the sun rise, but also to pray for its light to spread over the entire world. The humankind now looks to the rising east with the hope to see the promise that this 21st century beholds for the whole world, because the destiny of the world will be deeply influenced by the course of developments in the Indo-Pacific region," unquote. And as far as India is concerned, our definition of the Indo-Pacific is an inclusive a region of the two waters of the two oceans, from the eastern coast of Africa to the western coast of the Americas. Speaking at that same forum, our Prime Minister also stated that when the oceans are open, the seas are secure, countries are connected, the rule of law prevails, and the region is stable, nations, small and large, prosper as sovereign countries, free and fearless in their choices, unquote. And that more or less encapsulates exactly what we are trying to achieve when we talk about our concept of Indo-Pacific, and where I would say that the trilateral cooperation, or the idea of a trilateral cooperation amongst India, Japan, and ASEAN would be a very important area of partnership for future cooperation. You've already heard Ambassador of Japan talk about India-Japan relations. I think we've had, in recent years, a very high level of sustained momentum provided by a high level of political exchanges at the highest level, including the annual summits that have taken place. Of course, there is a vast potential given the huge complementarities in the natures of our economy. Of course, we are extremely grateful to Japan for the official development assistance that has been provided and for some of the exemplary projects that have been executed, including the Delhi Metro and of course future ones in the pipeline, including the Ahmedabad-Mumbai high-speed rail and others that are there, including development of some industrial zones, etc. We value, of course, Japan's advanced technology, its management skills, the kind of investments that have come in, and of course for the development of our human resource development. And of course India, as our economy grows, as we get more and more integrated to the global economy, I think would become an important partner both for Japan and for the ASEAN countries, as well as for the rest of the countries in the region. We have, of course, with Japan, several institutionalized mechanisms, dialogue mechanisms. Bilateral trade and investments both are growing and promise to be better. And of course, our strategic partnership is the cornerstone, where we've talked about the strategic partnership to also have a global outreach. Moving on to the India-ASEAN relations. Of course, last year, as you would recall, was a landmark year when we had invited all the 10 leaders of the ASEAN countries to celebrate 25 years of our dialogue partnership, 15 years of our summit-level partnership, and 5 years of our strategic partnership. We have an established mechanism, almost 30 dialogue mechanisms that have taken place. And within ASEAN, of course, we have sub-regional groupings like the Mekong-Ganga cooperation, with a specific focus on the CLMV countries when it comes to India's development cooperation partnership programs. And of course BIMSTEC, yet another regional grouping where there are overlapping memberships of the ASEAN countries with the Indian subcontinent, which have helped in improving our understanding. Already, I think ASEAN is our 4th largest trading partner, and which comprises of more than 10% of India's external trade, and growing investments coming in both ways, which are of course pegged on 3 pillars of our relationship: political security, economic, and cultural relations. Within the ongoing programs of cooperation, I think our focus has been, of course, in enhancing connectivity, both physical and digital. Last year, when the summit was held, I think one area of cooperation that was discussed extensively was in the area of maritime cooperation, since all of us are seafaring nations. We have established institutional mechanisms, including the ASEAN India Development Fund and ASEAN India Science Fund, as well as a Green Fund, which again provide immense scope for doing specific constructive projects in that context. Again, when it comes to Japan and ASEAN, it has had an institutional relationship going back 3 decades, much like ours. Like us, they too have annual summits with the ASEAN. They also have a mechanism of an ASEAN +3, so they have an additional experience as far as that is concerned. I think Japan considers a more closely integrated ASEAN functioning as a fulcrum for regional cooperation, which is important for peace and stability, and that is a vision that India shares as well. India, Japan, ASEAN together also collectively are part of the RCEP negotiations. We participate annually in the East Asia Summit, in the ASEAN Regional Forum, and several other mechanisms which are ASEAN-led, which focus on ASEAN centrality, for which we have certainly specifically talked about. So when we look at the trilateral concept of India, Japan, and ASEAN, I would say that yes, we have a shared vision of an open, stable, secure, peaceful, prosperous Indo-Pacific region which respects international law and freedom of navigation, as pointed out by the Ambassador of Japan as well. We are all seafaring nations with our own unique experiences and expertise in maritime, maritime aspects of our cooperation, including development of the blue economy. Hence, we have a collective interest in ensuring that the global transit routes remain peaceful for us within the Indo-Pacific region. India's growing engagement is accompanied by a deeper economic and a defense cooperation individually with each of the ASEAN countries, as well as with Japan, as well as with large trading arrangements. For example, we have a CEPA with Singapore, with Japan, and of course East Asia, so that also has with the Republic of Korea. And we have an FTA with separately with Thailand, as well as with ASEAN. I mentioned to you already that we are part of the RCEP negotiations, where we hope to have a good outcome that will further enhance our trade relationship. Moving on to the Indo-Pacific as a region and how we look at global opportunities and challenges where our destinies are linked. I think maritime cooperation, which I mentioned already, was one area where we see immense scope for cooperation. Blue economy is one area which has already been discussed. We've had within India-ASEAN a series of seminars which have taken this idea forward. Ambassador of Japan mentioned about disaster management and humanitarian assistance. Yet another area which is common to India-ASEAN, India-Japan, Japan-ASEAN, and so therefore there is scope for cooperation there. For safety and security of our sea lanes of communication is yet another area. Infrastructure development, ports development, these are yet new areas that could be specifically talked about, and I'm sure other segments of the seminar would be talking about it. I do recall that just very recently India and Japan have had discussions on cooperation in space. That is yet another area where I see that India, ASEAN, Japan could cooperate as well, given the fact that India has in fact established a telemetry station in Biak in Indonesia under the ASEAN rubric, and an extended version of that is being developed now in Ho Chi Minh City. These are just some of the thoughts as food for thoughts for this particular discussion. So, but I'll stop here. But be happy to take questions subsequently. But I would say that yes, I'd like to congratulate Carnegie India for kickstarting a very important thought on these discussions pegged against this particular background, and where I think our focus should now be from talking about the idea being a good one to moving to concrete deliverables and actual implementation of some of the thoughts that have been articulated by our leaders. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Saran, for your remarks and very pointed suggestions there. May I now request the Ambassador of Thailand to India, His Excellency Chutintorn Gongsakdi, to.
Yes. I'm negotiating the challenge of getting to this. Okay, good morning, everyone. Actually, I'm glad that Carnegie organized today's discussion on the Indo-Pacific. It's one because for myself personally, I haven't seen a lot of traffic on this for some time. And number two, I'm glad that I got some instructions from Capital because otherwise, I would be going out on a limb. But as I said, there was a session earlier, a breakfast session, and we said, I kind of said that Indo-Pacific, discussion about Indo-Pacific is business as usual for for diplomats, because the world, still revolves as it has used to, and we see the rise and relative fall of players and so on. So for us, the Indo-Pacific is just another handle, on which to discuss world issues, regional issues, rise and fall of nations. And people have been, and while I have been off the topic of the Indo-Pacific for a while, I've discovered that, pleasantly surprised, and discovered that ASEAN, has been continuing its discussions about Indo-Pacific, and I reported that as of 7th of March, which is just a few days ago, the ASEAN 10 member states have agreed, on a outlook for the ASEAN Indo-Pacific region. Now this is at the senior officials level, so it will still have to go to ASEAN ministers and then eventually to the EAS summit, which is in November this year. But at least, the issues that we will be discussing now will be things like implementation. Basically the issues that you will be discussing today in today's seminar, so your input will be very useful. Again, I also mentioned this morning that implementation is actually not new in the sense that we've done connectivity before, we've done maritime security, we've done economic cooperation and so on, but we want to do things differently this time. That's why we're talking about trilateral cooperation. Ever since, let's say at least 2 decades, regional players have been involved in the ASEAN region. Okay, it's part of the Indo-Pacific. And but they haven't been coordinating as much. And I think the world now calls for more coordination, amalgamation. It's good, it's not to not waste resources, but also working together makes us better friends and neighbors, in this Indo-Pacific region, which almost covers the whole world anyway. So a peaceful, prosperous, friendly Indo-Pacific region is good for the world. From an ASEAN perspective, Indo-Pacific, for us, we always talk about economics, okay? And I'm from an economic background, so dollars and cents and well-being is always there. But we also talk about managing, the rise and fall of powers. And I used to say, and maybe it'll happen again today, that it's not only about China, but it's also about a future India. We will always be here, but then there will be people that come and go. The Americans, the Chinese, the Russians, they're always there, but they have a more Eurocentric view. They held their APEC summit in Vladivostok, and so on. And then India is on the rise. So we can't move, Thailand doesn't have a claim on Antarctica. So we have to live, we want our neighborhood to be one where everyone engages in a positive way, and without threat to our well-being. And I happen to believe, and I would tell a business seminar the same thing, that if you're not, and as I told you, this colleague from UK Embassy, his geographical coverage has just been extended, from Indian subcontinent to the coast, the Asian coast with the Pacific. And I said, there's so much projects and money to be made there, and you would be silly, to not have your, economic or your foreign policy perspective cover that. So anyway, so ASEAN will be there in your perspective. We can't run away. So let's see, what have we, I'm not going to read out what we've agreed, because then I'll have to seek a new job. But I can sort of talk around and hint at things, as my capital has been generous enough to do. Okay, they may not be sexy, but you have to remember that before we had this agreement, we were not in agreement, among the 10. So this is something in itself, and that is our Indo-Pacific dividend in itself, okay? So I've mentioned already that Indo-Pacific region is one of the world's most important economic and security driving forces. The economic dream that I mentioned, any of the flashpoints, and we can include Indian subcontinent as well, any of the flashpoints goes up, and you can say goodbye to your dream, and we want to maintain the status and dynamics of the region, the peaceful status and the forward-moving dynamics I can think of many other places in the world that I'd rather not be. So, you know, even though we have problems, you know, Chiang Mai has just been declared the most polluted city in the world on that day, but the headline doesn't say that. But still, it's still good to be part of this region. And there's an evolving strategic new equilibrium in the region, and it will keep evolving. So we just have to manage, you know, superpower, regional power relations. That's the business of countries, you know, like that make up the ASEAN region. Okay, luckily, you guys listen to us or are willing to engage us. You know, as ASEAN, countries like India, like Japan that are here, the Americans, the Russians, and so on. We're lucky in that way. So, we attach great importance to ASEAN's effort and discussions in developing an ASEAN common approach on the Indo-Pacific concept that focuses on closer cooperation and engagement among the players. Madame Preeti Saran spoke about the Mekong sub-region, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, and Thailand is also included there. I've been to meetings, you know, with all the development partners around, and they say, what do you want from us? I want you guys to talk together, to work together. So, what we want to see is that an Indo-Pacific concept that benefits us all, brings about closer cooperation and engagement among the countries in the region, rather than that we move forward, you know, towards conflict and confrontation. And that is very easy. Things are improving, and we're pleased with that. We are pleased with the progress of the ASEAN process in developing the ASEAN common narrative on the Indo-Pacific concept that reinforces ASEAN centrality. I used to say it in simple terms, you know, what does that mean? And I used to say basically that people talk to us. You know what it's like to be ignored. We don't want to be ignored. And people talk to us, that's fine. They don't have to come and get our sanction on everything, but talk to us. ASEAN centrality in the regional architecture and ultimately promotes peace, stability, prosperity in the region. Something that the previous two speakers also said, and I'm sure everyone will agree. I'm sure nobody in here wants war and annihilation and end of the human race, right? Or if you do, please don't show yourself. Therefore, it is important that the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook should be anchored on the principles that have long been practiced in the region, or at least we have long aspired to, which includes things that have been mentioned before: openness, inclusiveness, the 3 M's, which my foreign minister likes to say: mutual trust, mutual respect, mutual interest, and rules-based approach. We view that it is useful to have the principles of the 1976 Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. The ASEAN Secretariat website is going to get a spike in searches for this Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. It was in the early days of ASEAN when we were a prickly region, and this was sort of like, let's say, the 10 commandments of ASEAN. What do you aspire to sort of remind ourselves, you know, what we're hoping for. The other day, somebody came to dinner and then they said, without ASEAN, I mean, what is the value of ASEAN? We have peace. We don't have, we used to have border issues with everyone. Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar. My father was ambassador to Laos. He spent more time on the Thai side than on the Laos side. But now, you know, we're so friendly and so on and so forth, and that is the dividend of peace. The 3 M's, rules-based approach. We view that it is useful to have the principles of the Treaty of Amity included in our common approach. What we'll try to do is to reach out to others, you know, in the region to see if they too, you know, like those principles. And maybe those principles can be, and approaches, you know, can be part of what we do together in the Indo-Pacific. So some academics, you can go and have a look at them, okay? and have them applied, you know, among the relations of those players in the Indo-Pacific. Furthermore, in promoting a safe and prosperous region, the Indo-Pacific idea should also complement existing frameworks. So we're not trying to set up new frameworks, but then we're not going to people to say, abolish your framework. You know, that is lousy, get rid of it or whatever. It's not realistic. And in this context, we mention Indian Ocean Rim Association because that has the furthest reach. I mean, you know, I used to attend that, and I used to sit and think how fantastic, you know, it is. Or an idea of Australia as well. You know, Australia is one of the main players there. To be Australia and then to come up with Indian Ocean Rim Association and link Australia to the African continent, you know. And so we have to use those. And Ma'am mentioned Mekong Ganga. So we have our own Mekong sub-region framework as well. It's called the ACMEX, which it's not a catchy word, you know. It's Ayawadi Chaupraya Mekong Economic Cooperation Strategy. And what Thailand has come up with is the concept of development partner. So they're going around to countries like India, Japan, Korea, and others who have a role that they're already playing in the Mekong sub-region to see whether they want to be a development partner with ACMEX. But basically, you know, like I've talked to some countries, including here, so what is the added value? You know, we're doing our thing already. We have Mekong Ganga, we have Mekong Japan, Mekong Korea, and so on and so forth. Yes, that's the problem, because there's so many of them. And so would it be possible to integrate a bit more, you know, so bring up some of your projects into the same platform. So, and that reflects a little bit Indo-Pacific as well. It doesn't have to be this way, but this is our idea, Thailand's idea. And we should generate concrete deliverables that benefit the peoples of the region. Now this part is some of the areas of cooperation that ASEAN is thinking of. It's nothing you haven't heard before, but this is ASEAN 10. Maritime cooperation, which includes maritime security. Enhanced connectivity, no surprise there. Sustainable development, the SDGs. And economic related cooperation, you know, things like RCEP. And then you see that the Indo-Pacific and what we're already doing is not that different, except that we're trying to bring all the protagonists, you know, in quotation marks, or together in a more peaceful way, working together. I think that the change itself is not what you're doing, but in how you're doing it. So once the outlook is adopted by our leaders, ASEAN will share and engage with our partners in this at the EAS summit in November 2019, this piece of paper, which is only 5 pages long at the moment from the officials. So I hope the leaders don't make it longer. I don't think so. Anyway, we believe that practical cooperation under the 2 to 3 identified areas can be pursued in an ASEAN +1 format, as well as ARF and the ADMM, ARF ASEAN Regional Forum, ADMM plus ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting plus with all the dialogue partners. And the premier forum from ASEAN perspective would be the EAS Summit to discuss philosophical or conceptual, you know, but the implementation can be carried out in all the ASEAN plus forums. So Thailand views that other frameworks such as 2+X, including 2 dialogues and several ASEAN countries, it doesn't have to be all 10, you know, could also be explored and be taken forward on areas such as connectivity, maritime cooperation, sustainable development. ASEAN-centered regional architecture anchored on the EAS and supported by other frameworks of cooperation would best serve as the platform for, in our view, for such cooperation. We view that our ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook, that's not the new name, but you know, I'm just also complements the trilateral partnerships that have been discussed by my senior colleagues. And we finally, we appreciate India and Japan's support for ASEAN centrality and participation in the Indo-Pacific concept. I've mentioned before, and I've said it to our Indian colleagues too. I mean, India is, Japan, we've worked with Japan longer, at least Thailand and so on, and I truly appreciate the partnership that we have with Japan. They know how to do a partnership in a way that we feel respects us as we respect them, and any partnership that both sides can come out feeling, maintaining their self-respect and feeling respected by the other side is an honorable partnership. And it's very comfortable one. And we're working on that with other partners as well, but I would like to single out Japan for that. I've done Mekong Japan, and I've done other frameworks for some time. So I tell people who care to listen, just do what Japan does. And you'll see they're not aggressive, right? And even when they move to more, a little bit more military stuff and so on and so forth, it doesn't come across as aggressive. Okay, so they've done something right. And so I think that's all. We look forward to India's rise. India has a big role to play. Ma'am, I have to say that some of my colleagues at the working level, they say, we want to know more about what India wants to do in the Indo-Pacific. Then I'm thinking, it's quite clear, like India's role in maritime security, its role in the security area. Thailand and India have more cooperation in the last year, and more is going to happen this year than ever before. I feel it, I know it, I live it every day. So maybe this is India's part. And then we can do some other projects, when the trilateral highway comes on stream and so on and so forth, it will come. So I end by saying that ASEAN 10 is in agreement on an ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for sharing some very candid insights with us, and I think we have enough to sort of get going. So the one thing which struck me listening to all three of you is that I think there are at least three levels at which there is a clear convergence of views and agreement, right? So in the first instance, about what the conception of the Indo-Pacific is, and broadly speaking, what are the kinds of objectives that we want to pursue. I think everyone pretty much agrees that you're interested in stability, rule of law, freedom of navigation, prosperity, and so on. So I think there is clearly a great degree of agreement on those kinds of issues. I think the other thing on which there does seem to be a degree of consensus is the centrality of ASEAN itself for the Indo-Pacific, which I think both Japan and India have in public fora sort of affirmed at the highest levels that they see that. So in a sense, that then gives us a clear sort of platform within which to think about how to roll out a trilateral sort of cooperation. And then just each of your individual remarks, I think, also brought out the fact that there are sort of already existing overlapping mechanisms and circuits of cooperation, whether it's between India and Japan, between India and ASEAN, or between ASEAN and Japan. So in a sense, once again, just if we take these three levels at which the sort of convergence is set, I think we already have a very good starting point for today's discussion. So I know there will be lots of questions from the floor, and I don't want to take up too much of the time, but if I can just sort of maybe talk about one set of issues, which pertains to the question of sort of economic relationships, particularly with trade. And one of the things about this region also is that there are many overlapping sort of regional economic initiatives which are taking place, right? So for instance, ASEAN, India, and Japan are part of the RCEP negotiations, which are going on. But at the same time, Japan is also taking the lead in a rejuvenated and somewhat modified version of the TPP since the United States has sort of stepped back. And of course, there are other things being done in more bilateral contexts as well. So one of the things I maybe wanted your reflections on was, whether you think there is whether RCEP is kind of a good enough starting point for us to think about trade, not just trade in the sense of increasing volumes, but setting new standards, in terms of reintegrating Asia once again, and then thinking about global supply chains and such like things, or whether we need to sort of scale up the ambitions beyond RCEP as and when things move on. So maybe we could start with that, and I have one more question about connectivity. Ambassador, do you want to?
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. And before responding to your question, I'd like to mention a little bit about what ASEAN is now doing with regard to Indo-Pacific concept. I'm very happy to hear that ASEAN is now in the process of coming up with the concrete ideas how Indo-Pacific concept look like from ASEAN point of view. It's very much close to what we have been advocating for many years. So it is thanks to the discussion between ASEAN and Japan for what kind of a future we'll see in the Pacific region, especially rule-based order plays a very important role to play. So I'm sure that on that particular basis of a common understanding between Japan, India, and ASEAN countries, maybe we'll be able to come up with a more concrete result out of that. One of the issues you mentioned is trade is very important aspect of our partnership. We have made a commitment that RCEP will be concluded by the end of this year. That will create a larger, even larger sphere of commerce in this part of the world. But this is not exclusive. We have already bilateral agreement between Japan and India for many years already. Almost 10 years we have this history. And we have very kind of a ambitious plan of TPP 11. We have already come up with that. And I don't know India or other ASEAN countries will be able to join this in the future. We are very much open-minded which country will be able to join this. This is rather high standard kind of economic cooperation mechanism, but this is something multi-layers. But if you are comfortable with bilateral, but we are now coming up to the more regional scale, and maybe you can go up further to have a more high standard and global kind of trade rules producing kind of the mechanism. So again, we see a lot of potential with regard to trade negotiation, trade aspect of Indo-Pacific region, maybe based on this RCEP negotiation, in which India, Japan, China, and ASEAN countries are part of that.
Yes, thank you. And yes, I agree that the RCEP is a very important component for, if it were to be agreed equitably, for enhancing trade in goods and services. So certainly India has very actively participated in the RCEP negotiations with that in view. And I think it will be a very important instrument for not just integrating us in terms of increased trade and investment in goods as well as services, but also I think it will help put our companies in each other's countries as part of the value chain. And as India grows, I think certainly India becomes a very important opportunity and a very important market for the rest of the RCEP negotiating countries. And certainly it is a very attractive market for, just as India sources its commodities and other goods from the rest of the RCEP region. Certainly India also has a lot to offer in terms of a good market and access as well. So certainly I'm very sanguine and hopeful that the RCEP negotiations would be concluded to the satisfaction of all the participating countries in it. But that said, I completely agree with the Ambassador of Japan that we have meanwhile several other instruments, bilateral, regional, sub-regional as well ongoing. With Japan, perhaps we were one of the first ones to have signed on to a very comprehensive agreement which went beyond trade in goods to investment, which also covered intellectual property rights, etc. And again, we have it with several other countries, with Thailand, with Singapore. In fact, we concluded a second round of that as well, and with the Republic of Korea, quite apart from the ASEAN-India trade in goods and services and investments, so which also requires to be constantly updated. So
when you have a bigger grouping like the RCEP, which is 10 plus 6, obviously to get all of them on board is that much more time consuming. Whereas while we still have existing instruments that are working well, I think we should ensure that they continue to work well. Thank you.
There are 9 meetings left for RCEP for the balance of this year. The best case scenario is ending up with RCEP ministers and leaders meeting in November in Thailand. And best case scenario is it will be concluded there. If not, then Vietnam next year. And now the challenges are elections in many countries. The other one it's a fact of economic reality. Somebody came to me, imported from Thailand. They bought coffee from India, but the tariff is around 28% or something in Thailand from India. So he imported it to Malaysia, roasted it in Malaysia, and now it goes into Thailand duty-free. See? So this phenomenon is also of big concern in the context of RCEP as well. Okay, it's the tariff differentials. So this is one thing that people are looking at very, very carefully. And I can also say that the dynamics between big markets like China and India is also plays a big part here. All the difficult issues have been left for last. That also makes it hard, okay? And the other one is they have a rule called no reopening of agreed text. So everyone is being extra careful, before they nod their heads on something. So that's why, even though I believe that everyone is absolutely committed, because can you imagine the effect it will have on the global economy and on sentiment and so on and so forth. So I believe everyone is committed, but they don't underestimate how difficult it is, okay? And one thing that I hope you don't boo me, but in the context of Indo-Pacific, there's also something called APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. So I'll just throw it out there. Boo, ma'am is saying boo. And even the Thais, they're sending mixed signals. If I'm not mistaken, my foreign minister sent his special representative to the Raisina, something, and then she had a call on Indian side and mentioned India's membership of APEC, okay? Indian side followed up with somebody in Bangkok. The embassy went to follow up and the guy sort of talked it down, So what is India supposed to think, right? And so we messed it up ourselves. But anyway, in the context of the Indo-Pacific, APEC is there, okay? And I would like to see India in APEC. But Thailand has to get its act together and send the messages. It has to be consistent all down the line. And APEC has something called the FTA of the Asia Pacific. But China wants RCEP to be concluded first. And final point is that for people in trade, any market access is good. So any FTA, anything, we'll take it. Thailand as well, we will engage in any FTA that is available. Thank you.
Just one word about APEC. Japan always supports Indian membership of APEC for many years. So I hope that we can work together in order that in near future India will be part of APEC.
Well, thank you. I suppose the real challenge is, what the economists call, to avoid becoming some kind of a spaghetti bowl of overlapping things which get intertwined and try and come up with consistent standards.
Better than having a bowl with no spaghetti.
Exactly. And as you're saying, possibly RCEP is going to be the first stepping stone alongside APEC and TPP and other mechanisms. I do have some more questions, but I think I should hold fire and open up to the floor. please draw my attention. May I please request you to identify yourself and keep your questions briefly because we are running a little out of time. Yes, sir. And please say if your question is directed to any one of our panelists.
Actually, all three.
Okay.
Will the Kra Canal be built with Japanese assistance, Chinese assistance, Indian assistance, or no assistance?
Okay, thank you.
You know, I love this issue because, number one, I believe that Indians are concerned about whether this canal will be dug because, you know, the Chinese can come through the canal and reach here so quickly. But the point is that that debate was dead, you know, in Thailand until visiting dignitaries from India, and then your media keeps playing it up. So now I can say that the Prime Minister has asked the National Security of Thailand and the National Economic and Social Development Board, like your Niti Aayog, to study it. But it's unlikely. I mean, I've told people, the press as well, if it happens, I would be so happy because Thailand will be so rich, you know, collecting fees and so on. But unlikely. And then I even go to the extent of posting on Twitter newspaper reports about insurgency or, you know, attacks in southern Thailand so that you can get that. Number one. We do have 3 southern border provinces with insurgents. Okay, they are predominantly Muslim provinces, but they're very much a part of Thailand. But in the Thai psyche, if we dig this canal, it would be like dividing the country into 2, which we are not, you know. But people need to get their head over that, and it would be too difficult. But since, you know, many important visitors, predominantly from India, come and talk to Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister about this, you know, it seems the reasonable thing to do, well, you go and study it. And I hope that they'll study it, but nothing will probably happen. I have heard of a Korean proposal to not dig a canal, but to have like, you have the ship, and then you lift the ship onto some rail, some magnetic thing, but it would cost 2 lakh million baht, which is 4 lakh million rupees, something like that. Okay, but anyway, that's as it's unlikely, but it is being studied by 2 agencies, National Security Agency and our planning agency.
Thank you.
Well, my name is Dr. P.K. Verma. I'm heading NGO Economic Development Trust. We are in the business economics working activities, research survey, consultancy, etc. My question is with those who are in the policy frame, ma'am here, because he was in charge for the one of the zone here. So my submission is, I'm trying to know in what field India should modify and in what way, because we are confronted with the fast developing, other side is insurgency, and we have a Southeast Asian, so it's a most coming up zone, and we are also coming up very fastly in terms of economic development that we are seeing. So what India should take, some initiative that we have not taken so far, we should come out in the gist and your finding that may be of use for to enrich myself. That's the only thing. More of a clarification type. Thank you, ma'am.
That seems like a pretty broad question. Do you want to sort of take a stab at any part of it that you think?
Well, I'd like to believe that certainly there are all initiatives are work in progress, and I cannot imagine that there'd be several others that will come up in the future as initiatives that would integrate us further to the East Asia, ASEAN and beyond. But I would say that the initiatives that have been taken in recent last 4 years, 5 years, I think, have been our Act East policy. And under that, we have really tried to weave in 2 kinds of integration. One is maritime integration of all our maritime neighbors, and the other is connecting our own east and northeast states through the land connectivity provided via Myanmar, as well as just a more focused development of the northeastern states of India to integrate that growth story of India's growth story with that of the further east as an beyond India. So I think those are already work in progress. I mean, it'll take a while before it shows dividends, but yes, I'm sure policymakers in the future would be able to evolve more such policies which will further help in integrating that. Thank you.
Just talking about Japan-India relationship, this policy really an important part of our Indo-Pacific region. So we have been talking already with regard to possible project implemented together in neighboring countries like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. And also, as Saran mentioned, we have already established mechanism to reduce connectivity projects surrounding India, but also we are talking about the importance of development in northeastern region. We have established so-called Actis Forum 2 years ago. I am a chairman, and Foreign Secretary is the chairman of this important forum. We are trying to identify some of the projects with regard to connectivity, roads project, and bridges, and also how to make use of a bamboo product, for example, and the disaster management project. We have already implemented some project in this region. So we are already have established mechanism with India. Maybe you can have something similar in a bilateral, trilateral context with ASEAN countries too, to have a more concrete discussion what kind of project we can implement together. So I can happily report to you that in these 2 or 3 years, many good progress have been made with regard to connectivity project within India and the countries surrounding India. So we are going to promote even more. We have to have more efforts to include some countries like ASEAN and others.
This is for the Excellency, the Japanese Ambassador. Please do not get my question wrong. It will be posed with the utmost respect. Given the Indo-Japanese very close ties, how is a major Japanese, or why is a major Japanese English language paper publishing the article of a retired Pakistani ISIS officer on the latest developments? And please don't tell me, Your Excellency, about the freedom of the press. That's for you. Yes, yes. You're the ambassador.
Sorry, I don't know what kind of reports Japanese English papers are reporting.
It's an
Article about?
On the Indo-Pakistani trade-off by a former Major General in the Pakistani ISIS in the Nikkei Review.
Oh, it's of course I cannot intervene in this what kind of articles, but please give it to me and I read it.
In any case, I presume it's worth hearing all voices in all forums, right? Yeah. We had a question right at the back. Somebody. There was a gentleman. Sir, do you want to?
Excellency, what is the status of Asia-Africa Growth Corridor? Whether you feel it's moving smoothly, you have identified some projects, or if not smoothly, then what are really the challenges that you are facing?
There are two aspects. One is government-to-government kind of cooperation by providing ODA assistance to some of the African countries. So we can work together with Indian government. India can provide some line of credit, some technical assistance. Japan can provide ODA loans and some technical assistance too. We have some, I cannot tell you in detail, but we have already identified some of the projects, for example, as I said, in Kenya. So we are trying to finalize what kind of, burden sharing between Japan and India, because this is difficult to have a joint, very strict kind of a joint venture. Maybe you can do it, for example, we can provide infrastructure, or India can provide a soft technological side. So we can be a little bit pragmatic with regard to finding out some good project. It's a little not easy. Even with other countries, we have some programs, implement together, but you have some difficulties to coming up to the concrete result. But with regard to business, I'm telling Indian, Japanese companies, especially operating here, that they are really looking toward West to have more business opportunities, not only Africa and Middle East. It is a good place to do business. I mean, India is a good place to do business with these countries. So we have established Japan-India Business Forum to discuss what kind of concrete matching will take place between Japanese and Indian companies too. I cannot tell you at this particular moment, the big project is now ongoing, but there are a lot of interest from both sides. I know that many Indian companies are approaching me to introduce some Japanese companies who have an interest in doing business in African continent, especially eastern part of Africa, because Indian companies have a lot of experience and networks in this part of Africa. So we like to make use of this for the sake of Japanese companies. They have technologies, they have financing, but they don't have enough experience in doing with African continent. And this year, August, there is another round of Tokyo International Conference of African Development, in which more than 40, 50 African leaders come to Japan to discuss the issue of development and business. I hope that Indian government, Indian companies can join this kind of endeavor to have a joint project, not only government but of business sectors, to have some concrete result out of these dialogues. So I'm very keen to have something concrete. It takes a little more time, but I hope in years, months, I can report to you something very concrete. Thank you for your attention.
There are more questions, but I'm really sorry, but we are out of time. So it only remains for me to thank your excellencies for taking your time and sharing your perspectives with such candor and setting the stage for the discussions to follow. I think many of the topics and themes that you touched upon will be more elaborately discussed in the sessions to come. So please do stay on for the rest of the day's proceedings. There is many more interesting panels coming up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellencies. We would move straight into the next panel, which is a continuation of the conversation which we saw at the inaugural panel, promoting maritime security cooperation in the region. If I could please request my co-panelists to come to stage. Dr. Jagannath Panda, Institute of Defense Studies and Analyses, Vice Admiral Anil Chopra, formerly member of the National Security Advisory Board of India, and Ms. YingHui, S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies.
Oh, very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can we settle down, please, to keep to the time? Right. This second panel is on promoting maritime security cooperation in the region. We have a distinguished panel. We will follow the same modalities. We will give them 10 minutes to expound on what they wish to speak, and then perhaps a few comments from me before throwing it open to the House. This particular topic, I'm glad it's been framed in the way it has, because I, for one, have got issues with all the sub-phrases of the topic itself. I don't know whether we are firstly talking about promoting maritime security cooperation, or are we promoting maritime cooperation? There is a bit of difference in that, which I hope will come out. I don't know what region we are talking about. We are certainly not talking about the Indo-Pacific as a whole. The security issues in the Mozambique Channel and the east coast of Africa have got little to do with the Japan-ASEAN India trilateral. In effect, what I'm saying is the Indo-Pacific is too large and has too many diverse sub-regions with very different interests and threats for it to be discussed as a whole. And last but not least, we talk about maritime security. I don't know what that means, despite having been a practitioner of it for over 4 decades, because there is a little bit of confusion of security against what and whom. When we talk about maritime security, are we talking about a Westphalian maritime security, that is tensions and conflicts between nations? Are we talking about security against an aggressive power? Are we talking about security against terrorists or pirates or armed robbers? Are we talking about security against nature and tsunamis and earthquakes? So there is, in my mind, I would like to just highlight that when we talk about maritime security, it is in a very diffused fashion, with many people having many different perspectives on what maritime security means and who is it directed towards. So that's what I'd like to say in the beginning, and maybe, and I hope that the panelists will highlight some of these issues as they go along, and we will then perhaps question them on the same later. So we will go on in the same order as here in this agenda. Ms. YingHui, I hope I've got the pronunciation right. I will go off first, and then Dr. Panda, followed by Darshana. Thank you. Could you?
Okay, good morning, everyone. Hope you don't mind that I'll just sit here because I don't have a PowerPoint. So thank you, Admiral, for the brief introduction to the panel. I think it sets out a few important points that I'll try to address in my discussion, because that is exactly what's the problem when I was looking at the topic given to me. What exactly do we mean by maritime security? And I think as I go through my presentation, you'll see some of the points that Admiral has brought out coming out. Just the way that maritime security is actually defined. Just to set the tone for my brief remarks here, my focus would be more on the ASEAN region, since I was given the task of talking about Singapore's perspective on maritime security with a focus on Japan, India, and ASEAN cooperation. So I won't actually talk too much about the proposed trilateral cooperation initiatives, because I'm quite aware that we have a whole panel this afternoon which will talk about that. So my presentation would talk briefly about India-ASEAN maritime cooperation, a bit about Japan-ASEAN, and then I'll end my remarks with some brief thoughts on ASEAN viewpoints on the Indo-Pacific, and also some thoughts of possible ways to bring the proposed trilateral cooperation forward. So to start off, for the India-ASEAN Maritime Cooperation, on a brief strategic level, I'll say that ASEAN as a whole, and definitely Singapore, appreciates and definitely welcomes India's increased engagement with ASEAN through the Act East policy. In terms of the maritime aspects, we see that India shares ASEAN's vision for a rules-based order, and specifically here we are talking about a rules-based maritime order and values for freedom of navigation and things like that. So during the ASEAN Commemorative Summit that was mentioned earlier in the morning, which was held in January last year, the 10 ASEAN leaders and India had a commitment for enhanced collaboration in the maritime domain. And it's useful to point out that the issue of maritime security and cooperation was also the theme for the leaders' retreat, which again highlights the importance and aspiration for increased maritime cooperation between ASEAN and India. So, and also, as I'm looking through the themes of discussion for what's ASEAN and India's maritime cooperation, the issue of having new maritime trade routes and the importance of maritime trade and connectivity was also another issue that was brought up a lot. So again, going back to Admiral's brief opening on what exactly do we mean when we look at maritime cooperation? Is it in terms of the traditional sense of naval competition or cooperation, or is it the various non-traditional security issues that we have, IUU fishing, environmental issues, or is it really about trade issues now? So then, going back to my talk here, again in November last year, we also see that at the India-ASEAN Informal Breakfast Summit, we also see that we're actually very glad, as Singapore is very glad to see that Modi stressed the importance of ASEAN in the Act East policy, the important concepts of ASEAN centrality, the consensus-driven approach. I think this is very important for ASEAN and for Singapore, just because of there's been rising anxieties in the region of what is the role of ASEAN, the concepts of ASEAN centrality that was also mentioned in the panel earlier this morning. Basically, where does ASEAN stand in this broader Indo-Pacific concept as such? So as Admiral mentioned again earlier, the Indo-Pacific is a really broad region, so what role can ASEAN play in there? And going back to a brief information on ASEAN-India, we're currently on the third or the 2016 to 2020 plan of action to implement the ASEAN-India Partnership for Peace, Progress, and Shared Prosperity. And maritime cooperation is definitely an important aspect of that. And we will definitely like to see that increased cooperation would take place within existing ASEAN-led mechanisms, such as the expanded ASEAN Maritime Forum that was again mentioned earlier in the morning. And just to put across my point again, ASEAN or Singapore sees, is heartened to see that India shares ASEAN concerns of maintaining freedom of navigation, the importance of rules-based order based on UNCLOS. So that is something that it's really appreciative of. And in going back to the issue of maritime trade and connectivity, cooperation between ASEAN and India has also made significant progress in recent years. India was ASEAN's sixth largest trading partner in 2017. Trade between ASEAN and India was over 81 billion in 2017 to 2018 and constitutes some 10% of ASEAN-India's total trade. So in terms of economics, it goes back to the point of RCEP, and definitely I think we'll welcome the early conclusion of RCEP hopefully by the end of this year, which should it will result in the world's largest trading bloc. So India's commitment to connectivity in cooperation with ASEAN's master plan on ASEAN connectivity is something that can be increased and worked towards too, as Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said and identified trade and connectivity as the two focus areas that India and ASEAN can look to and improve in the future. So going back to India's connectivity initiatives with ASEAN, in December 2017, India hosted the first ASEAN-India Connectivity Summit, making India the third country after Japan and China to initiate a delegated meeting with the ASEAN Connectivity Coordinating Committee. And also, there are also various projects going on, including possible talks for the, and ongoing talks for the ASEAN-India Maritime Transport Cooperation Agreement, as well as the India-Myanmar-Thailand Trilateral Highway that was again mentioned a lot in this morning. So going back to other non-traditional security issues, India has also been very active in this front. For instance, India organized the second ASEAN workshop on blue economy in New Delhi in July 2018. And there has also been working together with the other EAS members on, so there was an EAS statement on combating maritime plastic debris in November 2018 in Singapore. So coming to the end of my short brief about India, going on to Japan, recent years has also seen significant renewed interest of Japanese in Southeast Asia, especially in the maritime domain. Increased in 2015, the revised US-Japan Defense Guidelines explicitly identify a role for Japan in capacity building in Southeast Asia with countries such as Indonesia, Myanmar, and Thailand. And by these, I'm talking about naval cooperation, capacity building, transfer of skills. So for instance, the Convention Vision in late 2016 highlighted Japanese government's desire to pursue a further defense cooperation initiative with ASEAN. So I'm aware of the time, so I'll not go too much into detail in this. But again, moving on to another concept of what do we mean by maritime security cooperation, maritime cooperation in a broader sense. There's also the connectivity and infrastructure aspect of this. So as we all know, probably as an extension to Japanese focus more on the South China Sea, there has been increased, I wouldn't say increased, but a renewed Japanese interest in Southeast Asia, in the Bay of Bengal in Southeast Asia. So Tokyo has signed economic partnerships with various Southeast Asian countries, including Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines, Brunei, Indonesia. And Japanese trade with the Mekong regions and states in the Bay of Bengal have also grown significantly over the last decade, and it's now has grown significantly over the last decade. So clearly, there's a significant real orientation of Japanese investments and economic cooperation, as well as assistance to this region. So in the 4-year period from 2013 to 2016, net investment flows from Japan to India and the Mekong region exceeded net investments into into China by over $2 billion. So again, Japan has also pledged to assist Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam with at least 150 quality infrastructure projects. Here we see probably as an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative as part of Tokyo's new strategy for Mekong-Japan cooperation. So going on to the last part of my presentation on how ASEAN sees the Indo-Pacific concept. So I think this was mentioned a lot in the first panel already, so I'll really try and make it really brief. So I think one problem that ASEAN has, and including Singapore, I would say, with the Indo-Pacific concept, is like what the Admiral mentioned in his opening, is really a very broad definition. No one really knows what it's meant. And I think that's the problem that ASEAN have to sign up to something that it's sort of unclear, because each and every one, so US, Japan, Australia, India, each one has its own understanding of what the Indo-Pacific is. And also, just to throw out another point out there, I think ASEAN is also very wary of the possible anti-China connotation to such an Indo-Pacific concept. So is it a good name to use? And these are all ideas out there that we can discuss further in the discussion session. So as mentioned by the Thai ambassador earlier, ASEAN's working towards a common concept paper on the Indo-Pacific. Just to add, I can see that it will probably be based on principles on inclusiveness, stressing that it's not aimed at any particular party. Everyone in the region, including China, would be encouraged, welcome to join. And also working on specific, the need for specific projects has also been mentioned a lot. And I think for ASEAN at least, we want to see the maintenance of ASEAN centrality. So the evolving Indo-Pacific concept to be an ASEAN-centric one, utilizing many of the existing ASEAN mechanisms out there instead of throwing out new mechanisms of initiatives. So maybe a relook at what are some of the ASEAN maritime related initiatives in this case, which there are plenty, which deals with what are some of the overlaps, what are some of the areas that can be increased and can be improved on, and also looking at some of the bilateral projects between Japan, ASEAN, specific ASEAN countries, India and specific ASEAN countries, and see how new players can join into the initiatives. So I'll end my remarks here. Thank you very much.
Hello. Thank you, Chair. At the outset, let me thank Carnegie India, Dr. Chaudhary and Darshana for the invitation. I was asked to touch upon the most important topic, that is the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, what we discussed in the breakfast session, in the closed door session, and also in the earlier session. I think if we see the India-Japan relation in last 4-5 years, there has been a lot of talk about Asia-Africa Growth Corridor and where does it stand. So in my presentation, let me address 3 points in specific. One is, since the proposal that came up from the Japanese side and from the Indian side, and when Prime Minister Modi announced in Ahmedabad in 2017 about the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, how far it has progressed, where does this project really stands today? The second point is that whether we have to really see it that it is a counter initiative to China's Belt and Road initiatives. And third is how to enhance this project in the context of India-Japan cooperation. Now, to begin with, I think if we see the announcement of Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which Prime Minister Modi did in Ahmedabad in May 2017, that was a timely announcement primarily because that time the Chinese were hosting the first Belt and Road summit, big summit in Beijing. And many of us thought that it is a counter-narrative, counter-initiative to the Chinese proposition. But today, if you see the way the geopolitics has evolved, particularly in Asia and in the context of India-China-Japan relation, I don't really see that Asia-Africa Growth Corridor is a counter-narrative to China's Belt and Road initiatives. But before addressing that point, let me show this map, present this map. This is not an official map of Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, but this is a map prepared by myself and my institute, which will give a clear picture about Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, what this conception is all about. And if we see this map carefully, both India and Japan are actually trying to address growth and development. They are trying to specifically bring out infrastructure development, trying to promote connectivity among almost 82 to 84 countries across Asia and Africa. It actually tries to establish a connections between Asia, factoring in ASEAN regions, focusing more on the ASEAN regions, and going all the way through the Indian Ocean to the east coast of Africa. Now, it's a PAN project. It's a PAN project as earlier in the earlier session, His Excellency Ambassador Hiramatsu pointed out that this is not an easy concept. This is a big concept and it takes time to implement such a project. So if you see from the last 4 or 5 years official dialogues that has happened between India and Japan and the joint statements which has been released, there has been a concentrated focus and also a lot of talk about how to enhance India and Japan cooperation in context of Africa. And I think that sets the stage for the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. Now today, if you see the joint statement of India and Japan, which has been released, the latest joint statement in 2018, we have mentioned in that joint statement about the establishment of a platform for Japan-India business cooperation in Asia-Africa region. Now, what is that Asia-Africa region? We cannot really talk about Asia-Africa regions without really talking about Indian Ocean region, and without really talking about some parts of the Europe. We cannot really overlook these two geographically important, one is maritime region and one is a important geographical land region. So Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, in my sense, it is a consultative mechanism. It's not a counter initiative as it is portrayed in the public domain. It is a consultative mechanism based on a pan-foreign policy framework of Japan and India. Number two, it is based on a pan-continental proposition. And it is a big proposition, and it will take time to enhance this project. Third is, I think the most distinct feature about Asia-Africa Growth Corridor is that it is based on an inclusive character, what we are actually really questioning about China's Belt and Road initiatives. And I think that sets the stage for the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, that this is a people-oriented project. It is a people's consultative project where African leaders, for the first time, was consulted by the Indian leaders and by the Japanese leaders on a consultative platform. I don't think earlier we have in such a global platform where African leaders have been given a equal stage by other countries' leaders in a trilateral or in a quadrilateral or in a multilateral platform where they will be taking part in the decision-making process. And I think that makes the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor the most important proposition in times to come. The second question, the second point what I wanted to address in my talk is that can we really envision that Asia-Africa Growth Corridor is a counter initiative to China's Belt and Road Initiative? Now, of course, we have every reasons to draw this conclusion that Asia-Africa Growth Corridor focuses on the regions and the areas what actually China's Belt and Road Initiative actually focuses on. It focuses on infrastructure development, it focuses on connectivity, it talks about people-to-people contacts, it talks about promoting cooperations through business deals. So there are overlapping areas between China's Belt and Road Initiatives and Asia-Africa Growth Corridor Initiative. So it is genuine to draw a conclusion that both are maybe counter narratives to each other, or maybe both are competing. But the way the geopolitics is evolving today, if we see, I do not really see there is of course there are competing space, and all of these three countries are big economies in Asia. They have their own interest. Competition is bound to happen. But if you see in a grand proposition, I think the Japan's nuanced position towards Belt and Road Initiative, the recent stand they have taken, the conditional support they are offering to China's Belt and Road Initiatives, and I think I don't really draw the conclusion by saying that Asia-Africa Growth Corridor is going to be a counter-narrative to Belt and Road Initiatives. And if you see India's position, we have taken a firm position about Belt and Road Initiatives. In fact, we are the only major economy in the world who have taken a strong position on Belt and Road Initiative by not participating in the last Beijing summit, which was held in May 2017. And I think the next summit is due in April. And I don't think there is of course, I'm not saying from this is purely from an academic point of view, but I don't really see India changing that position much. And I could clearly see that India still maintains that position of not really accepting the Belt and Road Initiative on its face value. But saying that, if you see the Indian position, India has not really ruled out of the possibility of cooperating on the connectivity issues and on the infrastructure issues with the Chinese. So that keeps the door open. And the way the geopolitics of the Asia is evolving, and given the Trump administration's approach towards Asia, and I think we are talking about consultative growth in Asia. And there, I do not really see Asia-Africa Growth Corridor is emerging as a counter initiative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. My third point is that what is the current status of this project and how to enhance this project. As Ambassador Hiramatsu pointed out in the earlier session, I think now we are into specific areas of cooperation. We have started the progress working in few areas. For example, LNG related infrastructure development projects cooperation is going on between India, Japan and Sri Lanka. In Myanmar there are projects, housing projects, education projects. India and Japan is doing cooperation with the Myanmarese government. In Bangladesh there are projects, for example railway bridge and road construction projects are going on. In Africa, as you pointed out, we are talking about cooperation in Kenya. But I think there are 2-3 specific broad areas where we need to really focus on in order to promote Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. If you see this map, China in Indian Ocean region, this map talks about the period where the Chinese have actually established their ports and establishments across the Indian Ocean regions. From 2006-2007 onwards, when Hu Jintao actually started its second tenure as the president of China, and China introduced that time, not really introduced, they actually revitalized the go out foreign policy strategy that time. And since that time, they have been successful in establishing almost 25 establishments all across the Indian Ocean regions. And some of these establishments are, of course, most of these establishments are bilateral oriented, but now they are trying to establish in and promote some of these establishments in trilateral and quadrilateral format. And I think that is one lesson what India and Japan needs to really learn about. But I think there are 3 specific broad areas where India and Japan needs to talk about in order to enhance the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. One is the country-specific cooperation. And I think that's a must. As Ambassador Hiramatsu pointed out, there are already project-based cooperation is going on in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and in Africa, in Kenya particularly. But we need to focus on Southeast Asia itself. And I think one country which is really key for India and Japan is Vietnam. Given the common, common strategic interest and the convergence India and Japan shares with Vietnam, it is natural that Vietnam can be a third partner. Of course, Indonesia can be a different kind of partner in terms of building greater economic convergence and promoting the regional mode of framework of cooperation. BIMSTEC is another multilateral mechanisms where we could really talk about cooperation. Within the ASEAN framework, we could talk about the cooperation. But I think more than all of these things, there is another important area which we should be really talking about in terms of enhancing Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, because that is the key to this success of the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. That is relying on the financing pattern and also try to generate more funding for the projects. As you rightly pointed out, right now, most of the mechanisms about Asia-Africa Growth Corridor projects are based on Japan's ODA projects and India's developmental assistance. And this is definitely not sufficient if we really want to establish this corridor. And let's understand one thing very clearly, that when we are talking about this corridor, we are not really talking about corridor in terms of connectivity and corridors in terms of physical or maritime corridor. We are talking about corridor in terms of growth, development, employment generation. We are talking about consultative mechanisms where maritime cooperation can be established. So that is one area where we need to talk about, and I think right now Asia-Africa Growth Corridor is heavily reliant on Africa Development Bank and Asia Development Bank. More development banks should come to assist this program, and I think that is one area where India and Japan should really work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. My co-panelists have covered a lot of ground in terms of covering maritime security cooperation. The previous panel highlighted how the convergences in India and Japan's initiatives and priorities with ASEAN, and then we heard ASEAN's a rather positive view of a trilateral cooperation between India, Japan, and ASEAN. And I think maritime security was one area that did stood out in as far as practical steps that we can take forward in this trilateral cooperation. But when we talk or discuss maritime security in Southeast Asia or ASEAN neighborhood, I think it immediately becomes a very contested or rather difficult conversation, because we immediately get wrapped up in the complexities and intricacies of the South China Sea debate. And it is an important debate. It is a conversation. It's a debate that all countries are engaged with. But I think we get so wrapped up in the confrontations and the dangers of the conflict in South China Sea that we often oversee the opportunities that a theater like the Indo-Pacific presents for countries like India, Japan, and ASEAN to come together. While India has been discussing and debating the concept of Indo-Pacific for a while, it wasn't until last year at the Shangri-La dialogue when Prime Minister Modi initially put out a vision, India's vision strategy for the Indo-Pacific. And to quote from the Prime Minister's speech, I think two quotes that stood out, which essentially I think also brings this conversation to the core, is first was that he said the oceans hold the key to our future. And second, what he said was that ASEAN is at the heart of India's Indo-Pacific strategy. So there is a clear convergence between India's approach and Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific, both of which place ASEAN as a critical player. I think in taking the Indo-Pacific conversation forward with these countries, there's a case to be made in terms of coordinating policies between India and Japan and their approach towards ASEAN. Both India and ASEAN have identified maritime security as a key trait in its India and Japan have identified maritime security as a key component in its Indo-Pacific approach. There are multiple parallel initiatives, both on the non-traditional and traditional fronts, where that India and Japan are working with ASEAN. Both India and Japan are members of similar forums and mechanisms, some of which have been pointed out in the previous panels. East Asia Summit, expanded ASEAN Maritime Forum, and I think these conversations can be conducted through these forums. There's a space for India and Japan to collaborate on some of these areas while working together with ASEAN, and some of the areas where I think some conversations happening or there is potential for it is perhaps search and rescue, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, anti-piracy training and anti-piracy exercises. So these are areas where there is conversation already at some level happening, or there's more potential or interest to do more work in this. But I wanted to focus on 4 points. There are plenty, but I wanted to focus on 4 points where this trilateral cooperation can take this conversation forward. First one is connectivity. We've heard quite a bit about connectivity this morning. I wanted to talk about maritime connectivity. Connectivity has been a key pillar in the Indo-Japan relationship, and this partnership can now, I think, add great value in addressing some of the gaps in ASEAN with our ASEAN friends. Within maritime connectivity as seafaring nations and coastal states, good maritime connectivity with ASEAN countries will facilitate better trade and promote maritime security in their region. India and ASEAN are working on an agreement on maritime transport, exploring maritime cargo routes and coastal shipping services. I think there's Japan can bring in some of its experiences on this. We need better infrastructure to facilitate movement, which includes trade and transport, of course, but also tourism, which is a key area in the India-Japan, India-ASEAN relationship. Better maritime connectivity with ASEAN would also allow for improved movement of people and goods. So it includes ports and logistics and cargo terminals and facilities, but also infrastructure to promote tourism, digital connectivity between India and ASEAN. And Japan can play a strong role in addressing some of these areas with its tremendous knowledge and experience in connectivity projects. Japan has been engaged and involved in development projects with ASEAN countries for the last few decades, and it is privy to the working modalities of development projects in ASEAN. I think there are examples of India-ASEAN connectivity projects where Japan can play a role. Dr. Panda talked about Vietnam. I wanted to focus on Indonesia. I think Indonesia could become a starting point or a great partner in India-Japan relationship, taking this maritime connectivity forward. India is in conversation with Indonesia for the development of Port of Subang. We heard about it previously as well. I think there is scope for Japan to contribute in part towards developing the strategic deep sea port in Sabang. The other part where I think India and Japan can also work on and also connects to Indonesia, I think, is Andaman and Nicobar Islands. India and Japan have been talking since 2016 on the concept of smart islands, really essentially talking about sustainable development of islands, tapping into blue economy, promoting tourism. Andaman and Nicobar sits actually at a further distance than mainland India, and it is closer to Indonesia. Perhaps there could be better maritime connectivity which would allow for easier access to goods between Andaman and Indonesia, as well as for tourism, tourism and cruise ships between Andamans and Indonesia going out to Thailand and the wider Indian Ocean region. Second point that I think where there's scope is blue economy. Blue economy is a recurring point of conversation between India and its maritime partners. There's great potential to harness the maritime marine resources for economic and social development in a sustainable manner. ASEAN is looking at using blue economy to generate and promote employment. India just held its second working group with ASEAN on blue economy. To promote blue economy, to tap into blue economy, you need technology, you need infrastructure, you need training, you need technical expertise. And I think these are some of the areas where India and Japan can work together. This brings me to my third point, which is also the interesting point for me personally, is really the scope of technology in maritime domain. India and Japan are already investing and collaborating immensely on technology and innovation. Can this collaboration now be extended to the maritime domain? If this collaboration can actually indeed be extended, I think this will be a great contribution in promoting and securing the maritime space. The trilateral cooperation can look to explore research and innovation in marine biotechnology, in coastal tourism to promote maritime security. Be it blue economy, be it maritime domain awareness, technology has a role to play, and I think it's time to debate and discuss debate and bring technology to the maritime space, and especially to address non-traditional issues, which is a great starting point always. Fourth, and my final point, is capacity building. We've heard about it again in some points. There are multiple parallel initiatives between India and Japan, both from the military point of view and non-traditional point of view, in building efforts of capacity building in terms of exercises, trainings. I think there is some of this can be streamlined, some of this can be collaborative. There are standards and practices of law enforcement and training on various issues, including traditional and non-traditional. I think there is India and Japan together with their relationship with ASEAN, through their technical expertise, through their assistance and through their training, can offer these initiatives jointly to the ASEAN countries to better strengthen their capabilities to defend their own coastline and also strengthen their maritime security interest. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Well, we've had three wonderful presentations, and they've all stuck to their time. So we have some time for discussion now. But before I throw open the house, I'd like to reiterate what I said in the beginning. I think what we are talking about, or what we have heard, is maritime cooperation and not necessarily maritime security cooperation. And I think we need to explore this a little bit, and I will certainly ask the panelists to give me their views. You know, things like connectivity projects, trade, corridors, etc., blue economy, these are all parts of maritime cooperation between countries, mainly geo-economic in nature. But the topic was maritime security cooperation. And I am only saying this because whenever we discuss maritime security cooperation, what I actually hear is maritime cooperation. Unless, of course, and there is a point to it, that you say that maritime cooperation lends itself to solidarity, and that itself is an element of security. But this is an issue which needs to be deliberated. Maritime security is a different ball game, even if it's at the policing level, even if it is not at the military level. It requires capacity, it requires capability, it is expensive, it requires expertise, it requires interoperability, it requires a willingness to do things together, whether it is patrolling together, sharing intelligence, etc., etc., etc. So we have this clear distinction which must be kept in mind by all who think about these matters as to what are we doing, are we cooperating, in which fashion. The second point, which is a question mark in my mind, and I will ask the panelists to please respond, is would it be more practical for India to deal bilaterally with ASEAN countries or in security matters, or would it be appropriate to engage ASEAN as a whole? We have the same problem with the European Union, where we have engagements bilaterally in security matters with France or Britain or elsewhere, and we don't necessarily have so much of a security arrangement with the EU as a whole, though we are trying, there is attempts to do it. So the practicality of maritime security cooperation with India-Japan is okay, but how does it fit into the ASEAN business? And nobody talked about China except in passing of competition as by way of BRI, etc. It is the elephant in the room. Issues of sovereignty and territoriality are there in the back of all our minds, but they are not normally articulated nor debated in fora such as these. But when we look at the whole picture of maritime security, maybe that should also form a backdrop of the discussions. So with that, I would request the panelists to briefly respond on what I may have said, and then I'll throw it open to the House.
Okay, thank you, Admiral. I'll try my best to answer the few questions that came up. So the first one was between maritime cooperation and maritime security cooperation. And Admiral, you're absolutely right. That's often a confusion of what exactly that means. But let me just say a bit in terms of what you mentioned, security, not definitely in the naval sense, but also in terms of policing sense. So in terms of the ASEAN context, there is actually cooperation within in terms of, for instance, the Trilateral Patrol in the Sulu Celebes Sea, and also the Malacca Straits Patrol. So in terms of this, there is cooperation, and I'm sure India is a support of the Regional Initiative of Piracy, RECAP, that is based in Singapore. But in terms of, for instance, the Sulu Celebes Sea issue, personally, I don't see a role for outside partners at this point to come in, including Japan, India, and China as well, just because these are very sensitive, as you brought out, sovereignty issues, and also a lot of times I think there's also the contention between port state control, user states control, and the rights of user states, and that applies to the Straits of Malacca and Singapore as well. And in terms of whether India and ASEAN should work on a bilateral or multilateral level in terms of security cooperation, this is just my personal sense. I think it is always good to start at a bilateral level, just because ASEAN is a very diverse grouping, and it's difficult, as I think it was mentioned in the earlier panel as well, as in terms of consensus within the 10 ASEAN countries, sometimes it takes a bit of time for ASEAN in itself for us to come to any sort of agreement. So just to give an example, ASEAN and China held the first maritime naval exercise just recently. So although activities has been going on bilaterally between China and the individual ASEAN countries as well, and the US ASEAN maritime exercise is due this year as well. So I would say probably at the bilateral level is a good starting point, and then building up to a more multilateral sort of cooperation. The elephant in the room, China, yes, it's always, I think, in the back of all our minds. In terms of ASEAN countries, the South China Sea is definitely something that we always have to take note of, although currently things have toned down a bit. I'm not sure if everyone in the room agrees, but my argument has always been that at least everyone is now at the negotiating table, despite of what China is still doing, having military installations in so-called islands, man-made islands in the South China Sea. But I think it is a good starting point. And Singapore and I think ASEAN is always talking about the freedom of navigation importance, and that this also comes back to Admiral's point. When we're talking about freedom of navigation, the US is definitely talking about military in terms of military maneuvers and stuff, but when you look at the Chinese perspective, it's often about commercial freedom of navigation. So often I feel like we are always talking past each other when we talk about these things, and it really doesn't help. So maybe can have more candid discussions on these issues and can come to a better agreement on this.
Very briefly, that point is very valid in the sense that we need to distinguish between maritime security and maritime security cooperation and maritime cooperation. And I think in the India-Japan context, both the issues have been discussed, but in particular context of Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, if you see the vision document which has been released by all the three tanks, RIS, IDE, JETRO, and IRED in Jakarta, that document specifically mentions about maritime cooperation and maritime cooperation leading in future to security cooperation, but it doesn't really emphasize on maritime security cooperation per se. Your second point about India dealings with ASEAN partners on security issues, I think it is going currently, as I could see from India-ASEAN engagement, it is going concurrently. On the one hand, we are promoting our military and naval engagement with most of the ASEAN countries, with Vietnam, for example, and with Singapore, for example. Singapore military people we are training, and there are many other examples. But at the same time, I think what has been the standout point in India-ASEAN engagement is the discussion on maritime cooperation per se, which has been the distinct feature of India-ASEAN commemorative summit, and since last 7-8 years we are continuously discussing about that. On China issue, you are absolutely right. I think we need to discuss more in specific terms what the kind of concern and security challenges China brings to the regions. But again, 3 points in specific. One is the sovereignty aspects needs to be carefully looked at when you are talking about BRI. Second, transparency issue. Third, I think even though the Chinese are claiming that most of their projects are people-friendly, I don't think those projects are really people-friendly. And as we could see, there are serious grievances coming up from Sri Lanka, from other countries, including from Pakistan. And I think that sets an example for many other countries internationally to review the mandate of BRI and before accepting BRI on a face value. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Admiral. I think maritime security cooperation and maritime cooperation run parallelly, and at points they also converge, right? I mean, even if you're talking about by the time you get to the stage of information sharing, you also have to do initiatives which will build trust to be able to get to the point where you are exchanging that kind of information. And that trust is only going to come through the initiatives in addressing challenges and gaps that that region faces. And I think the points that most of us have pointed out today are in the non-traditional sense, are the areas where ASEAN is interested in working with. I think one way where we have is you go to countries and you offer what you have to offer in the table, and the other is to listen what the region wants. And if the region is saying they want infrastructure and they want connectivity and they want blue economy, I think that is something that we can offer, and that builds your trust and your platform to grow on it and build maritime security cooperation. We are doing naval exercises bilaterally either way. Trilaterally, I mean, there was conversation about India, Singapore, Thailand joint exercises. It hasn't taken off. There will be limitations, but those limitations should not push us towards the wall against taking it forward. So I think there are convergences and they run parallelly. I don't think so. We need to distinguish that clearly between the two in terms of working with ASEAN.
Well, floor is open. Any questions? Over there, could you please identify and ask short questions? And to whom do you wish to address?
Any one of the panelists or all of them? My name is Siddhartha. National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bengaluru. After Brexit, will ASEAN and Japan support, not support, or be neutral about an Indian naval base in Diego Garcia? Number one question. Second, would Japan be interested in a large underwater robotics laboratory between Japan, India, and Singapore?
Diego Garcia, does India want a base in Diego Garcia? That's the first question.
No, the question was, would Japan and ASEAN support any such move?
I mean, the question of supporting such move, I guess, comes if there's a political appetite in India to build a base in Diego Garcia, right? Which I don't think exists at this point in time.
Not at this point, but it may be day after tomorrow.
I guess we can take the take the question when it comes to that. In terms of robotics, I think India and Japan are already working on robotics specifically on this. I guess this could be a conversation that could take forward with ASEAN.
I was fascinated with that slide you put up about China and the Indian Ocean region. And I would like the panel to speculate about 10 or 15 years down the line when China's GDP has almost caught up with that of the United States. Today, the most powerful navy in the Indian Ocean is that of the United States. And trade flows exactly as it is because the hegemon desires that it should flow. When the hegemony gets transferred to China, or in the process of being transferred, or at least China takes over the hegemony in Asia, it's going to throw its money around in this Belt Road initiative, and it's going to appear in various places in the Indian Ocean, as your slide showed. We already see what happened in Baruah, Panda. Same thing is going to happen in Cambodia, the Kunming, Singapore Railway, Tanzania, Kenya, and so on and so forth. The liberal democracies are going to insist on a rule-based order, and they're going to push back. What's ASEAN's position going to be? Because ASEAN has shown itself really incapable of defending its own interests in the 9-9. So is it going to bend to the Chinese wind, or is it going to line up with the Asian, with the liberal democracies and push back against China? Anil, I'd like you to speculate on this also.
Very valid observation. In fact, if we try to see it in the context of my presentation, Asia-Africa Growth Corridor and Belt and Road Initiative, I think one of the prime distinctions between Belt and Road Initiatives and Asia-Africa Growth Corridor is Belt and Road Initiative is based on a unilateral model, unilateral proposition of China's national interest and all. Whereas Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, as I mentioned, it is based on a consultative mechanism, it is based on a universal idea. And that's the primary distinction. And therefore, and I think if we try to apply that thing in ASEAN context, that would answer probably your point, is that ASEAN is very much caught in that universalism versus unilateral initiatives. Most of the ASEAN countries, they want to engage with China. They can't really run away from China, Chinese economic proposition. On the other hand, they cannot really support the Chinese initiatives, the Belt and Road initiatives on their face value, and also the kind of maritime posture the Chinese Navy is posing in the regions, particularly in South China Sea. Last 10 years, militarization process in South China Sea has been the key concern for most of the claimant countries in Southeast Asia, including other countries in Southeast Asia. And that's actually answers the points that the ASEAN is very much caught in whether to go for a universal phenomena or to support the China's unilateral proposition. And I think our Southeast Asian colleague can.
Okay, so I'll just at this point, if I got your question correctly, yours, where do you see China moving? Well, definitely, I would say, although China is developing its navy, it's still nowhere near the standard of the US, even in, you mentioned 10 to 15 years. Personally, I don't see them having that kind of naval projection power in 10 to 15 years. So, coming back to, so my point is that China, it's not a maritime nation like the US, so it has a lot of domestic land-based problems that still gives the army a very large focus in the country itself. And in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, I think we all know the problems of it, the lack of transparency, for instance, but I also think that is important for ASEAN to engage with China. So the fact that we don't support certain of their concepts or ideas, I think we have to try and engage with them, see where they're coming from. So for instance, Singapore, although it's not a recipient of Chinese infrastructure funds for projects, for instance, we're still working with China on the Belt and Road Initiative as such. So for instance, the China, we have worked with them to set up a mediation center with the Singapore Mediation Center. So in the hope that by working with them, we can encourage them to be coming on to a more rules-based type of order in terms of not only in the maritime domain, but also in terms of commercial projects. That's it. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. I just want to take the point on the rules-based order. And you're right. I mean, even when our conversations with ASEAN, we keep saying rules-based orders is important. It's one of the areas that we say a lot with ASEAN. But again, whose rules and which orders? Because everyone has different rules. China did not accept the PCA ruling on the South China Sea. We are yet to say how UK will respond to the Chagos jurisdiction, the tribunal. So I think the rules probably will be rewritten slightly, or China will behave like a big power where it will accept what is convenient to you and will ignore what it's not. But groupings like perhaps EU and ASEAN will become swing states in deciding how the next regional architecture or the new emerging regional architecture will be shaped, and how we engage, how middle powers and big powers engage with these groupings individually and multilaterally would depend a great deal in terms of upholding this rules-based order.
Oh, well, I'll just chip in because you asked me to chip in. But I have a problem with the hypotheses. We've been hearing for very long that America is on the decline. You just need to go to the GDP, world GDP chart, one chart. The US share of the world GDP has consistently been around 25, 26% for the last 55 years and doesn't seem to be declining in any fashion. Secondly, I think the Chinese are good at setting agendas. They say in 2049, because that is their centenary anniversary, we are going to be the largest economy, the largest power. But I'm not so sure. I think a week is a long time in politics, said Churchill, but a decade is a very long time in geopolitics. And I would think that for the first time, China is facing a series of different headwinds in the economy, in social unrest, in the leadership, in the pushback, in the lack of maritime power, which he very correctly pointed out. And I am not so sure that in 10 years, China will be in any, or 10 or 15 years, China will be anything more substantially, relatively, than what it is today. In fact, people can wager whether it would be on relative decline or not. Just to end this, and there are many maritime enthusiasts here, China possibly has the worst maritime geography in the world. Worse than Russia, worse than Germany. You can't become a global power till you are a maritime power, a great power. You can't really become a maritime power till your geography is right. China, even if it dominates all of the China Seas and the Northeast Asia, is very restricted in breaking out into the open Pacific or the open Indian Ocean. They're bottled up, and this only if its adversaries have the capability. So I don't want to go into this too much, but I think this scenario 15 years down the line, that China would be able to challenge the status quo in the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific. I'm not fully in agreement with the hypothesis itself. So I think I'll leave it there, sir. You wanted to say something?
Yeah. In fact, about that point, I mean, I'm completely in agreement with you that there is always unpredictability, is there about China's rise. If we try to assess China's rise domestically, the ethnic problems, the economic problem, the questions, the domestic debates about the future of the Belt and Road initiatives, their governance issues, a lot of issues are there. But the point you mentioned is a very valid point that they are very good in setting agendas and looking at the things from a future point of view. In fact, the slide I showed is that all of these 25 establishments they have established, some of them are ports, some of them are stationing points, some of them are maritime bases. We should not really read all of these bases and establishments in isolation. We need to see that from where they started. In fact, if, as I mentioned, during Hu Jintao's time, there was a major policy change happened. But 2002, 2003, China actually started offering a lot of donations to one of those single multilateral organizations which is there in Indian Ocean region, Indian Ocean Rim Association, which was earlier known as Indian Ocean Rim Association of Regional Countries. China was not a member, but China started giving donations to the smaller countries. And that fact needs to be noted down carefully. Thank you.
Okay, we started late, so I'm going to extend it by 10 minutes from your lunch. So we have 2 more questions. I think there were 2 people at the back who were very early, there and here. Okay, the 2 hands over here, and I'm sorry, the 1 hand there. But please make it very brief, and I request the panelists also to be brief in their answers, because we got 10 minutes to lunch.
Going ahead with the point that the actual panel discussion is supposed to be on security cooperation, I would like any of the panelists to give the thought that what do they think about IONS and ASEAN cooperation? As it is, as I would agree with that gentleman when he says that ASEAN is filled in South China Sea, there's plenty more left in West Pacific and South Pacific. So would ASEAN think of doing something with the IONS to save the balance of the West Pacific? Thank you.
Vietnam can be the third party in India and Japan Maritime cooperation. So can you go further in your idea about that?
The last question, Good
morning. I just have this one question. There's been a renewed. My name is Anil. Thank you. I just had this one question that related to Maritime Security Corporation. Now we've been looking at how significant the discussions on the Quad have been, but there was no mention of it at all. So I feel, considering both India and Japan have a role to play there, how do we see that? Thank you.
Very quickly on Vietnam question first. And I think if you see India-Vietnam joint statement, Japan-Vietnam joint statement, India-Japan joint statement, all of the 3 joint statements separately points about third country cooperation. And that brings, that's establishing kind of natural triangle among these three countries. But Vietnam is special in the context that Japan has a strong outreach in Vietnam. Japan is the largest ODA provider, second largest foreign investor, third largest tourist source, and fourth largest trading partner in Vietnam. So that makes, given India's growing strategic convergence with Vietnam, so Vietnam can be a natural partner. And if we try to also understand from Vietnam's point of view, you have a two corridors, one economic circle plan, which is actually facing a lot of challenges from China's Belt and Road initiatives. So time has come where we could link it with the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, and particularly in specific plan of India-Japan cooperation. These are the areas where we could work on. The second question was about IONS and ASEAN cooperation. I think there is a lot of over-expectation from ASEAN that ASEAN should take a position. Not necessarily ASEAN has to take a position on each and every security matters. There are different countries, different entities involved in ASEAN, and it is a little far-fetched to expect from ASEAN that there will be a singular voice coming from ASEAN where there will be a effective security cooperation happening. And I think it's a little far-fetched to expect cooperation between IONS and ASEAN, but again, between India and ASEAN, a lot of maritime talks are going on. Third point, last point, very briefly about Quad. A lot of exaggeration again about Quad. We should not miss out that basic point. It's just a consultative forum. There are many quadrilateral initiatives are there, many trilateral initiatives there. Quad is just a consultative dialogue forum. Thank you.
I'll just make my remarks really short. So I agree with Dr. Panda on the his point about ASEAN being such a diverse country. So I'll just end my thing there. And on the Quad, let me just say that the Quad faces the same issue with the Indo-Pacific, but from an ASEAN perspective, I think the Indo-Pacific is a lot more inclusive than the Quad. So I'll just end there.
I too agree with Dr. Panda in saying that it's too much to ask ASEAN to always have a uniformed voice on all matters. IONS ASEAN as a whole, ASEAN, I'm not sure. That's ASEAN's call. But I think some bilateral countries there are, like for Milan, we have some Southeast Asian countries who come and participate. So I'm sure that can happen. But ASEAN as a whole, I'm not sure. Quad, again, I echo the sentiments of my co-panelists. I mean, I don't think so. Naval cooperation in the hard military sense was ever really a strong case to be made on the table. Diplomatic fronts, it's still a consultative mechanism. It's ongoing. So that's all. Thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of this panel, and there seems to be unanimity about the fact that there is plenty of scope for cooperation on the maritime front in all sorts of hues between ASEAN, India, and Japan. Thank you for your participation, audience, and would you please give a round of applause to our panelists who have done a great job. Thank you.
Lunch is served just outside these doors here.